Joelle Taylor is a queer, working-class British poet with a few poetry collections under her belt, one of which is Canto, a really staggeringly beautiful but very dense collection of poetry. And this is The Night Alphabet, her debut novel, which gave me a full-on existential crisis, and I'm kind of grateful to it for that. I have a lot of mixed, complicated, irreconcilable things to say about this novel, so let's dive in. I should say up front that this isn't really a book review. This is me using The Night Alphabet as a kind of jumping off point to talk about something that I find difficult when it comes to fiction and literary expression in general. And that is the conversation that happens within a text, within a piece of fiction, between the plot and characters and the writing itself. That's what I want to talk about here. Because The Night Alphabet, when it comes to that conversation between those two elements, is complicated and frustrating. Now, at the time of recording, The Night Alphabet is a brand new novel that a lot of people are talking about and singing its praises. It is one of the most highly rated novels of this year so far. People adore it. It's probably going to win awards, and I think it should. However, my relationship to it is not entirely rosy. Far from it. The Night Alphabet has a pretty simple but also very, very unique premise. Our protagonist is a woman named Jones. It is the 23rd century, and Jones is covered in tattoos. She's walking through Hackney in London, and because this is a sci-fi setting in the future, there's a lot of weird stuff around. Our clothing works as a projection that we can change at will. The weather and climate and seasons seem to be able to change from street to street. And when she arrives at her destination, a tattoo shop, she talks to the artists about the fact that these days tattoos are also usually projections of a kind. But Jones asks these two women to tattoo her in a traditional method. Jones is already covered in tattoos, and what she wants from these two artists is a line tracing all of her tattoos, joining them up, a path between them. Pretty simple, pretty easy. But she also has a vial of her mother's blood, and she wants that mixed into the ink. This is vital. The artists don't want to do it, but eventually they agree to it. They start tattooing her, this line to connect all of her tattoos with her mother's blood in the ink. As this happens, Jones reveals to these women that she, her mother, and every woman in their family has the ability to jump into the lives of other people throughout time. These things are called rememberings, and they don't happen at will. They happen quite randomly, sometimes when the women are asleep and sometimes in less ideal circumstances. They fall into the lived experiences of people throughout time, sometimes from the future, sometimes from the past. And as Jones is being tattooed by these women, each tattoo she has on her body represents one of those rememberings, and she jumps back into it. She tells that story to these women. So effectively, this is a short story collection, but it's also a novel. The closest comparison I can think of is Haunted by Chuck Palahniuk, which is both a short story horror collection and a novel with these stories twisted into it. That's what this is. We move from remembering to remembering, short story to short story, but after each one, we jump back into Jones's body, and Jones is talking to these artists. The stories vary in terms of setting, quite wildly. The first one we go to is in 1911, in a coal mine in Lancashire. Our protagonist is a teenage girl whose father has just died of black lung from working in that mine. Her family needs money, and so she dresses as a boy and takes her father's place, goes down into the mine. And we don't just see things from her perspective, but also her mother's, and also the mining foreman's as well. I'll tell you about a few of the others later on, but that's the basic premise. Now, The Night Alphabet is gorgeous. It is arguably one of the most beautiful novels in terms of its language and its expression that you will ever read in your entire life. Joelle Taylor is a poet first and foremost, and as almost always happens when a poet turns their hand to prose, gorgeous things come out. Poets cannot help but express themselves in certain ways, in abstract ways, where every line is poetry and every line can be surreal and strange. And that is a boon and a detriment from where I'm standing. Much like something like The Picture of Dorian Gray, every single line in this book is poetry. Every line could be highlighted, could be framed, could be tattooed on you. It's gorgeous. There's no getting around that. It is simply stunning language. The imagery, the metaphors at play, it sings and it dances constantly. And I'm not entirely comfortable with that. I struggled with that fact so much as I was reading that I felt myself falling into a panic attack over it. I'm not joking. Now I need to say up front here that prose and poetry both make up pretty much my entire life. I myself am a poet. I got published recently and I hope to continue to get published. I perform at open mic nights and poetry slams around Glasgow, and it has given me a new lease on life. I write good queer poetry and I want to keep doing it. I love poetry. I've been reading tons of poetry, including Joelle Taylor. I'm discovering new poets all the time, especially queer poets, working class poets, feminist poets. I'm addicted to poetry in a way that I haven't been addicted to anything. It feels like it keeps me afloat. But I also love stories. I love prose. I read at least 10 novels a month and I review almost all of them on this channel. I love stories. This book is both. And I'm not sure that's a good thing. At the turn of a page, it is a good thing and then a bad, and then a good again, and then a bad again. It frustrated me constantly. And I didn't really like being frustrated by it, but I also did. Because it was challenging. I'm kind of grateful to this book for getting me to think the way I've been thinking ever since, the way I'm thinking now as I talk. See, the poetic nature of the language in this book, I feel, is kind of detrimental to its impact. As you go on through this book, you begin to see a pattern, a theme at play. The stories in this book are mostly, if not entirely, about masculine and patriarchal abuse of women. Men taking advantage of women, men hurting women, men asserting their power and their dominance over women. That's the recurring theme of this book. Now, I've read plenty of powerful poetry about that. Lots and lots of great feminist poetry about patriarchy, about toxic masculinity. I've written some of it myself. I know the power of this poetry. It's impactful and it's necessary. It is fuel for our fire, which is a phrase I keep saying a lot in my videos right now. And I've also read plenty of great feminist novels. I talk about them a lot. I've made videos about them. I love feminist fiction, especially when it's aggressive, transgressive, strange, disgusting, ugly, and horror-fueled. I am no stranger to either. But because this book is both just smushed together, I am irritated by that. And here's why. By being as poetically staggering and beautiful as the Night Alphabet is, I feel as though that waters down the impact that the book could have had. The kind of queer and feminist and anti-patriarchal poetry that we enjoy is beautiful in part because of its brevity. A feminist poem will make a statement, will use language and form to make a specific point. It's something you'll read over and over again. Each time you read it, it takes maybe a minute or two to read, and you continue to revisit it, and you think about its structure, you think about its language, you think about the imagery, the metaphors, etc. You deconstruct it, you bond with it, you internalize it, you feel it soaking into your skin. You feel like you're becoming one with it. And feminist narratives, feminist prose, and queer narratives and queer prose, they serve a different function. They do something similar, they have a similar impact arguably, but they are a different form, and that is intentional. They are stories about women, about queer people who struggle, who are abused, who are hurt, who are taken advantage of, who fight back perhaps, who rise up, who change things. And as we read these stories, we bond with these women, and it's a writer's duty to encourage that bonding. And they do that through their language, through the dialogue of these characters. We get to know them, we get to know their lives, their experiences, their relationships, etc. We get to know them gradually, steadily. We bond with them. We hold hands with these people. The language allows us to do that. The language is frank, but impactful, clear, but powerful. There is a narrative flow, there is a consistency, and there is an immersion that comes with that flow. The Night Alphabet does not have any of that. It is a novel presented as poetry, and it is incredibly jarring. I could not bond with any of the people in this story. I could not lose myself in their world. Not just because these were short stories and I would quickly be moving on to something else, but because the poetry took precedent. I did not know these women. I found it hard to bond with them because there is so much that is abstract and strange in here. There's something frustrating, something annoying in having to make the statement that poetry and prose are different and we should keep it that way, because art is fluid and expression is fluid and we should be able to play with these things and merge them together and have them swim together in the stream. And that's what this book is. It is poetry and prose fused together, but I was frustrated by it for that exact reason, and I'm annoyed at myself for being annoyed about it. This is the existential crisis I've been feeling about this book. I'm just going to read you 2 passages of several that I highlighted as I was reading this, just to show how powerful the language and poetry and everything is. The first thing I'm going to read is from that first story set in the coal mine. It's told from the perspective of the daughter who lost her father and will eventually take his place and go down into the mine. And this is just the first paragraph. When they opened him up, Mam said they found a coal mine in his chest. She said his lungs were the wings of blackbirds, which is why he whistled when he breathed. He was singing. She said his mouth was as black as the pit, and I dreamed there were children lost in there. That is gorgeous poetry. Very literally, they opened him up and found that his lungs were black. That's what killed him. There is human connection between her and her father, idealizing the way that he sings, idealizing his goodness after his death. The coal mine in his chest might be literal, but it also implies that he lived what he did, that he was a proud working class man. Children lost in his chest could be the sorrowful loss of innocence, loss of childhood, a childhood he maybe never had the opportunity to have, which was the case for most Victorian children, especially those in the working classes. There's a lot to read into here in this single paragraph. As a poem, this paragraph is magnificent. It is Joelle Taylor doing what she does best. It is glorious, it is evocative, and you sit with it for a long time. Problem is, this isn't poetry, it's prose, and you have to keep going. You have to keep reading it, you have to find your flow, bond with these characters as you go, follow the narrative as it builds and it shifts and it changes and it ebbs and flows, right? It's very hard to do that when every single paragraph is so chock full of imagery and metaphor and therefore feels incredibly surreal. When a poem is full of metaphor, you don't question it, because that's what poetry is. But when prose is full of metaphor, suddenly it's a really, really staggeringly strange, disorientating, dizzying piece of surrealism. And I just didn't enjoy that fact. It was frustrating. A little bit later on in the novel, there's a very, very short story about a few different women who are killed by men. These women might be their wives, girlfriends, mothers, daughters. They are killed by masculine abuse. And there are these shadows that appear at their bodies. These shadows take the shape of a cat, a crow, and a fly. The cat, the crow, and the fly go to God, who in this is described with they them pronouns, which of course I loved. They go to God and God turns them into spirits of vengeance. It's an amazing short story. And I'm going to read you a paragraph about a man abusing a woman and the spirit of vengeance coming for him. The husband was picking out new wallpaper for the master bedroom when his wife returned. She grew face first from a flower motif on the wall. The husband dropped his tools and retreated, overawed by the complexity of his murdered wife. Being violent, he expected violence, but she only spoke his name, but she only asked why, but she only inquired after her sons. And he said, but my heart is a fist, and my kiss is a fist, and my sons are a fist, and my love is a fist, and I never understood how to unclench, how to release my fingers like uncurling petals. The fury hovered over him, her hair umbilical. Let me show you, she said, and he did. What men do to themselves is worse than any woman could conjure. It is said that a cat found him, and did nothing. The repetition here is sorrowful. Again, this is gorgeous poetry that I could analyze for hours. I really enjoyed that penultimate line that speaks truth to the fact that toxic masculinity harms men as much as it harms women, that it encourages isolation, that it breeds incel culture. And there is an incel story in here as well about 2 guys who meet on a message board and go out IRL to abuse women. Toxic masculinity and patriarchy harms men, maybe not as much as it harms women, but men are not victimless to patriarchy. And this poem, as I keep wanting to call it, talks about that. You can see how gorgeous everything in this book is, but I felt like that conversation I mentioned before between story and characters and the language itself, these 2 things were constantly talking over each other. This in prose is more important than this. Language should be gorgeous, should be evocative, should be playful, sure, but it shouldn't ever detract from the story and the characters, because they are what you bond with in prose. You follow the story, you bond with the characters along the way, and the themes are revealed through that interaction. But these two things are at odds all the time in this book, and so I was all the time loving every moment I spent with it, and hating every moment. Deeply frustrated at the fact that the poetry detracted from the narrative. I have no grander point to make except that. It felt like a shame. Joelle Taylor is an incredible poet. I love her poetry. I love her expression. I love her queer, anti-patriarchal feminism, of course I do. I live and breathe that stuff. But when it comes to building a piece of prose out of poetry, my brain doesn't like it. My brain does not function that way. And I couldn't help but just feel frustrated. I had a pounding headache while reading this novel. That is an enormous shame, because it's a wonderful piece of creativity and every line is poetry. That doesn't mean it always had a positive effect on me as a reader though. And I'd love to hear if you found something similar while you read this book, if you have. Let me know. Now it's time for my Patreon book recommendation of the week. This recommendation comes from Amy Zarrett, and I'm very excited about this one. Amy recommends We Sold Our Souls by Grady Hendrix. It is a masterpiece of horror with a strong female protagonist. Hendrix is so good at writing women. He hooked me from the beginning with the protagonist working as a night clerk at a hotel. I've always thought that would be a spooky job, and heavy metal music being a force for good is such a lovely touch. I am a huge fan of Grady Hendrix, and I wholly agree with the statement that he's really good at writing women. I particularly love the female protagonist in How to Sell a Haunted House, but I've never heard of We Sold Our Souls. That's weird. There are two Grady Hendrix novels I haven't read yet that I keep meaning to read. Horror Store and the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, I think it's called. I really want to read both of those. But they can be hard to find in the UK because I don't think they have a UK publisher. Anywho, big Grady Hendrix fan, big metalhead. This sounds fantastic, and of course I'm going to read it. Hendrix really is great, I can vouch for that. If you're a horror fan, well, you probably already know Hendrix, he's a big name, but he really is a man who is great at writing women, and that is rare. Thank you, Amy. If you'd like to give book recommendations that I feature at the end of videos, you can support me on Patreon. Thank you very much, and subscribe for books.